Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another of our Living with Lions webinars. We appreciate you being here today. I'm Deborah Chase. I'm the CEO of the Mountain Lion Foundation. Interest in trapping is dwindling nationwide, yet fur trappers kill 3 to 5 million animals each year for their pelts. Millions more die in trapping programs run by state and federal agencies. Trapping's death toll includes non-target animals, including some endangered species, as well as pets. They're all accidentally caught in these indiscriminate traps. There are efforts across the U.S. to change trapping laws. The Mountain Lion Foundation is among the organizations working to protect wildlife from trapping. And today we have a panel of experts who lead the campaigns to tighten trapping rules across the West. They're talking with our Western Region 1 coordinator, Michelle Blake. Take it away, Michelle.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon, everybody. Our three panelists, as Deborah said, work on trapping reform in several Western states, and we're going to discuss the issues with them, and then you'll have a chance to ask your questions directly to them at the end of our conversation. And one note, we do not plan to show you any graphic images today, and our panelists will give you a warning if they think they're about to share anything that might be disturbing. So let's introduce our panelists. Stephen Capra is a career-long conservationist and an anti-trapping campaigner. He's the executive director at Footloose, Montana. The Mountain Lion Foundation and Wild Earth Guardians, among other organizations, work in partnership with Stephen and Footloose, Montana to try to get dangerous traps off of public recreation spaces in the Missoula, Montana area. Chris Smith works with Wild Earth Guardians, and his role there is to protect persecuted and imperiled native wild species in the desert Southwest and then in the Southern Rockies states. He works on trapping and endangered species, along with campaigns to end wildlife killing contests and to reform the way that wildlife is governed in Western states. And finally, Lisa Robertson has been involved with land and wildlife conservation projects for more than 30 years. She pilots a small Cessna aircraft, which she uses to take big picture images of wild spaces to document the landscapes and the species there. And then often she helps agencies and individuals in their research of populations of wildlife such as wolves, grizzlies, cougars, coyotes, and elk. She is the co-founder of Wyoming Untrapped. So let's bring you all on now and start our conversation from where you sit today in New Mexico and Montana and Wyoming. You are working on trapping issues that are fairly consistent across all of the Western states. And I'd like to start by asking each of you to summarize the trapping laws in your three states. Chris, we'll start with you because you're assigned to work in a number of states on these issues, but using New Mexico as an example, can you describe how trapping is usually practiced and regulated there?
Yeah, happy to, and thank you for having me and for putting this on. I think it's really important. It's a critical issue. I think there's not a lot of awareness around it in general, and you know, it's an important animal welfare issue certainly, but it's also a really important conservation issue in this time of kind of a biodiversity crisis and a mass extinction event. So thank you for that. Speaking about New Mexico, trapping is legal here on nearly all lands, including public lands, Forest Service lands, BLM, state lands, and then private lands with permission. And trappers target primarily fur-bearing species. We don't have intentional trapping of wolves here, thankfully. Our wolves are listed under the Endangered Species Act, but they do sometimes get caught. Traps are allowed to be placed fairly close to roads, trails, campgrounds, recreation areas. There are some minimal setbacks, but not enough to keep people and pets safe. And, you know, one of the biggest troubling things down here for me is that there are no bag limits on any of the fur bearer species that are trapped. So a trapper pays $20, which is a pittance when you think of it in the greater scheme of things. And he or she, usually he, can kill as many legal animals as he likes for private profit. And that's kind of the state of play down here in New Mexico. The legal trapping season is about 3.5 months, but there's some species that can be trapped year round because they're utterly unprotected, and those include coyotes.
Yeah, which is the situation in many states. Lisa, let's talk about trapping in Wyoming, where you are working. Maybe you can describe what trapping issues you're addressing there and how trapping is regulated and practiced in Wyoming.
You bet. And thanks for having me as well. We're really pleased that you're getting involved. Our story is not quite as happy as Chris's story, I'd say, but we trapping in Wyoming is all year round for predatory animals. That includes wolves and foxes and coyotes. So every day of the year, there are traps out there on public land and private land. And you can, and with those animals, you can kill them in any way. So if you trap them, you can shoot them, you can strangle them. It's animal cruelty is alive here. Wolves are designated as predatory animals, predatory status part of the year, and 85% of the state. And the trophy game wolves are actually hunted. You buy licenses to hunt those in certain areas of the state. So there's trapping all year long in regard to wolves as well. And then fur bearers, there's a season. It starts about October 1st and runs through April. And you have to have a fur bearer license to hunt those animals. And it's not just trapping. You can shoot them and kill them in any manner. So it's trapping year round, even on private land.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, Stephen, if you can talk a little bit about trapping practices and regulation in Montana and what you're working on with Footloose Montana and your campaigns there.
Sure. Well, thank you also. It's great to be part of this panel. Some great people on it. And at Footloose Montana, we're starting to fight back, I think fairly aggressively, but we have a lot to fight against. Montana, like Wyoming, is like turning the chapter back to the 1890s, except you don't have any trappers wearing fur coats and snowshoeing. They are using power boats, they're using off-road vehicles, they're using snowmobiles to invade the wildest parts of the lands they can and set the traps. And our season begins November 1st. And that's really the day in Montana that everybody has to begin to fear going outdoors. And it's a time of year all of us like to be outdoors still. There's great things to be doing. But the trapping season begins, and it begins with gusto up here. For $28, you can kill 5 wolves in traps, and you can trap anything you want, really. And what we see a lot in our state of is areas get trapped out of, say, pine marten, or they get trapped out of swift fox, only to have them reintroduced so that trappers can have another chance at basically eliminating them. In my conversations with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks up here, the agency that manages wildlife, they've made clear trapping in our state is really for recreation. It has nothing to do with controlling wildlife or anything to do with, trappers like to say disease or things like that. So really, this is wildlife being used for somebody's idea of recreation. And so, and I should add that, the recent election was just devastating for us in this state. We lost the governorship. That's the first time we won't have a Democratic governor in 16 years. We have a completely Republican legislature. And I think with neighboring Idaho being the most radical that we've seen on the wolf issue, we can anticipate some really bad things to flow from that in our state. And that's what we're working very hard to stop. And I'm happy to get into any other details. One of the details that you guys mentioned was like, are there setbacks? Setbacks in this state are so confusing that nobody could really figure it out. On a hiking trail, 50 feet. So imagine you're hiking with your dog they smell something within 50 feet, they're in a trap. You know, with wolves, there's in theory 150-foot setback from closed roads, and again, it has to do with what part of the state. And so it's a very confusing mismatch. The bottom line is, though, if you come to Montana, the people in control of our public lands are trappers. And that's completely illogical, given how much people like to enjoy outdoor recreation.
Gotcha. Thank you all. And like I said in the introduction, you know, they're working in New Mexico and Montana and Wyoming, but the issues that they're facing are pretty representative of issues throughout the West. And I think that the next thing we want to do is just an introduction of some of the vocabulary and tools of trapping, because Stephen mentioned setbacks, which is where these traps are allowed to be set. So the devices are part of the issue. We're going to review what devices are used commonly in trapping. Other issues involve the time requirements, and that's, you know, how often the trapper is required to check the trap. In some areas, that's as long as 72 hours, which means that an animal could suffer for 3 days or longer in a trap. And then there are the issues of where the traps can be set, such as, you know, recreational areas or proximity to roads and trails that people are using. So I want us to get into all of those topics, but let's start with the nature of the devices, and I'll share my screen so that we can start with photos of some of these devices. So this is a leg hold trap. You hear it called a steel jaw leg hold trap too. And this is one of the most common, also one of the most controversial. A number of states have regulations on them where voters have either regulated or banned them, but they do remain legal in most states. So let's start by talking about these. And Lisa, I think you have one with you that you can show as well.
Yeah, I can show you this one, which is a Bridger Special, number 5. Maybe some people are listening know what this is, but this is a wolf trap, and it's one of the newer ones. So it's a lot stronger and a lot more powerful, and it, you know, has the chain with it. But I'm 140 pounds, and I cannot stand on these two levers and open this trap. So, you know, if an animal gets caught or if a dog gets caught and I try to rescue it, I can't do it unless I have tools to help. And we do have an untrapped pack our organization has put together with actually clamps to help clamp this down. So anyway, this is just, you can see how the size of my hand and how big these are. You know, they're huge. So.
Yeah, that is massive, and it's you see demonstrations. I know Wyoming Untrapped has hosted some workshops on how to release your dog if it's caught in a trap. And when I see those demonstrations, I always wonder, you know, in the moment, would you really be able to get a panicked dog out of a trap? And it's something that
this is a small one. Just give it a quick look. This is a very small one, but it can do a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
If an animal gets its toes caught, it's not going anywhere. So that's how they look. Okay.
Just in regards to leg hold traps, if I can jump in a little bit, you know,
Yes,
one of the common refrains that I hear from trappers and people who are otherwise defending trapping is that, you know, leg hold traps are so much better and so much more humane than they used to be. And you'll see trappers, you know, put their hand in a trap to try to demonstrate that it doesn't hurt. And I think it's just a bunch of bogus to claim that by adding, you know, a centimeter of space between the jaws, or by laminating the jaws, which is kind of increasing the surface area, or putting an extra swivel or two on the chain, you're not fundamentally changing the fact that these traps are inherently cruel. And you know, to me, it's like arguing about the details of an atomic bomb in some ways. You know, the damage is fundamental and the damage is there. And that's one of the most common refrains we've seen here in New Mexico. And, you know, if anyone has actually ever messed with a trap that's been set and hasn't been altered to make it, a show trap per se, you know what you're dealing with. And Lisa's exactly right. Those things are powerful. They are hard to open, and they inflict a lot of damage very quickly on an animal.
I would add to that just by simply saying, how many animals get themselves out of trap by cutting their own limb off? So obviously there's tremendous pain and suffering. And imagine the animal is wild, it's used to moving and being free. Suddenly it's caught, suddenly it's panicked. The fear that goes with this, and then suffering if you're up here in Montana or in Wyoming, sub-zero temperatures for days until somebody comes and finally shoots you or beats you with a club. I mean, the whole thing is archaic and is long overdue to be removed from part of our history.
Could I add another thing?
Yes,
Michelle?
please.
Most people don't know that any size of trap is legal in Wyoming. Doesn't matter. There are no limits. So there's a bear trap. It's 40 pounds. It's the only way you can even open it is with the big C-clamps, and it's legal. And tooth traps, they're still legal in Wyoming. They're not used very much, but they're still legal. That's how archaic we are. It's beyond imaginable.
There are some states that have eliminated these particular traps. You can help me out here. California, Washington, New Jersey.
Colorado, is that right?
Yeah.
Colorado and Arizona both have a lot of restrictions on public lands, but on private lands, I believe
Yeah.
legal traps are still pretty commonly used.
Massachusetts?
I would also add that trappers like to tell me all the time that wildlife doesn't feel pain. They looked me right in the eye and said, they're not feeling pain. You have to understand that. And that's pure insanity. Talk to a veterinarian about that. They'll make that very clear, and think about it yourself. It's totally crazy.
Yes. Sharing the screen again here. This is a picture of a conibear trap, which you'll also see called a body grip trap, I believe. And Lisa, you have a story about this particular trap and the situation.
Yes, about 2 years ago on July 4th, we got a call from a woman whose dog was caught in a conibear. The conibear was still attached to its foot. And the conibear was used for muskrat trapping in a private pond right next to a trail, public trail. And the dog pulled the conibear out of the mud and was dragging it along. And we were able to get it off because I knew how to do it. And she had a leash too. And but these types of traps are deadly. They're called quick kill traps. And this is a 220. And actually, this size trap was caught on a grizzly paw about 2 years ago. We saw moving across the snow, and the grizzly, a full-grown grizzly, could not put its foot down. There was so much pain. I imagine it dropped it eventually, the size of an animal like that. But these types of traps are indiscriminate. They will catch anything.
I can add a story, and this happened here in Missoula, within our city limits. And this was last November, and a couple had a dog, and the young man took the dog for a walk right down by the river here in the heart of the city limits. And a man had set an illegal conibear trap like that, and the conibear caught his dog by the head and the neck. And this guy struggled and fought for everything he had, and he could not get it off, and the dog died in his arms. And I'll tell you, when they caught the person who did it, and when you saw this person months later at trial, what you really realize for pet owners is it's a level of PTSD that people really never get over. And I've talked to a number of people who've had this experience, and they say it's so horrific, and to have the animal die in your arms is beyond comprehension, and you're doing all you can. And the first thing is you're in shock. And we've had women here in our state where this happened, and one of the women, there were two women walking together, and when the dog got caught in the conibear, the other woman had a heart attack on the spot. She was so traumatized, she had a heart attack, and she later died. These things happen.
Yeah.
Do you want to see the?
Yes,
I think-
please.
Okay. This is the conibear trap. It's the 330. It's the largest. It's one of the most horrific gadgets, steel devices on the planet, I think. But, you know, if your dog is caught in this, it's probably not going to survive unless you know what to do immediately. And you need special tools, which I carry with me in case somebody else needs it. But these, luckily, you can see how big that is. It's about 11 inches across, 11 by 11. So this type of trap in Wyoming is actually not allowed on dry land, on public land. As of the year we were founded in 2015, this was actually one of the first laws that was passed. And believe it or not, the trappers actually brought this up, actually pushed for this. And it's good because these types of traps, like Stephen said, you know, dogs are getting caught in them a lot. You know, wolves were getting caught, incidental catch, back at that point when they were protected. And so these are still used on private land, unfortunately. And on public land, if you set it in 1 inch of water, it's legal. So the next day, if there's no water, it's still legal because it was set in water. But still, it's dangerous, even for animals, for people. A young child was caught in one of these in North Carolina. He reached down and grabbed it and it caught him. So people have been caught in these.
Mm.
But, you know, there's a smaller one too, you know, smaller 220s, but this is what we deal with, this kind of device, littered across our landscapes.
If I could add one last thing on that, and I know I want Chris to be able to say something, but I wanted to just say, I just had a recent conversation with Fish Wildlife here. So let's take, in Montana, we have fishing access sites. Now you can't have a trap on land around a fishing access site for 1,000 feet beyond the boundaries of the fishing access site. However, you could set a conibear in the water, not if you did it from the shore, but if you came by in a boat and set it, then it would be legal. That's how crazy the laws are. They're completely irrational.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. You know, I think conibears are particularly horrific in that, you know, I think it's bad enough to catch and kill a target species, especially, you know, without any valid reason, which I think is what most trapping is done for. But, you know, to catch a non-target species in a body crushing trap like a conibear, there's no going back. You know, Lisa said you can, if you know what you're doing, you can get the animal out. But in my experiences, the stories I've heard, those things are very powerful and they kill very quickly. And even when they don't kill, you know, they maim and they mostly prevent an animal from recovering. Those are intended to kill. They can create a lot of suffering. Only 40% of animals die right away. But I actually had a young trapper come up to me once here in New Mexico, and he was kind of boasting about how he was going to go set 10 or 12 of these in cubby holes looking for foxes. And he was demonstrating the trap to me, and the trap snapped shut and he couldn't even open it with his hands, you know, and this is a supposedly trained trapper. And the fact that this is irreversible damage, I think, is one of the fundamentally horrific things about conibears and snares, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll talk about snares next. And it is common for the law to say that if you catch a non-target species, especially an endangered species, if it's alive, you have to release it from the trap. But it's hard to imagine that it would be released to much quality of life after this. So let's look at the snares next. This will be the last kind of trap that we're discussing. And Lisa, I know you have a sample of this as well, and that one of the new developments is that there are spring-loaded or motorized traps, right, that are more lethal.
Power snares.
Power snares.
You want me to show it?
Yes, please.
Okay. We've just discovered this type of snare in Wyoming. We didn't know it existed until it killed a dog in January in about a minute in the owner's arms. What you see is, this goes around the animal's neck. So when the animal goes through, it pulls it tight. But there's a remaining piece. So this is a little spring. I've got it tightened. If it goes off, help. But there's a little trigger right here on the bottom, which it's hooked to. So it's pulling that together, and you have to use a tool like this to set it. You cannot do it by hand. And so when the animal pulls it tight, then it pulls against this little trigger, and the trigger releases. In other words, it pops down, and this spring opens wide. So then it tightens it 2 or 3 inches tighter around an already tight hold on the neck. So unless you've got wire cutters, I've tried this. This is a little, you're supposed to be able to release it with this piece. When it's tight, I can't do it. I don't know, Chris, if you and Stephen have done it. But I've gone through several poles and sticks trying to figure out how to release this by hand, but I can't. And so we always recommend wire cutters. And if this is around the dog's neck and use a wire cutter, you have to cut the skin of the dog to get it off. It's that tight. It's already down into the skin. So always carry one of these, no matter what, wherever you are. But we are asking the commission to ban these, and we're not having much luck, but we want to ban them before more dogs are killed, or who knows what happens to animals, especially non-target animals.
The other thing I want to just bring up is when these things happen to dogs, and you're trying to free a dog, the same is going to happen with wildlife. I mean, it's not like you're just going to walk over and cut that off and the dog's going to stand there very calmly and let you do it. The dog's hysterical. There's a lot of trauma in moments like that. And so this is something that is really not simple. Generally, you have to put some kind of covering over the dog's eyes so that you can then proceed to do what you need to do. But this is why for people, it's a very traumatic experience, and you have to take training. We offer training courses. Lisa offers training courses in how to free the animals. And it's really a moment where you have to show a lot of calm, and having been taught that and going through a class is really beneficial in how you're able to respond at a time like that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Chris, just for information, we have a pet release brochure and that you can carry with you. It's water resistant, or you can download it to your cell phone. And we're letting you know about that, because if you can't go to a trap release workshop, if you have this with you, review it before you go out on a hike. Know to cover your dog's head immediately if it's trapped, so you don't get chewed alive. But anyway, I just wanted to these are free, and I just wanted to let you know that there are resources out there.
Yeah, I would just add, Lisa said you need wire cutters. You really need something heavy duty to cut these snares. Carrying around some pliers is not going to do it. And I've actually known people who carry pliers around and have encountered snares, fortunately not around a dog, and have tried to cut through them. And you just can't. You need something pretty heavy duty. I did promise not to show any graphic photos. I'm going to show this photo of Roxy, who is a dog here in New Mexico who died in a neck snare on public lands in 2000, must have been 2018, right around Thanksgiving, so right around now. And Roxy's owner is a pretty capable guy, could not manage to get the snare off of Roxy. Roxy died in his arms. And as he's carrying Roxy out from this public recreation area, a bobcat jumped out from behind a tree who was also caught in a snare, struggling, dying. Scared the crap out of him. They later had to euthanize the bobcat. New Mexico Department of Game and Fish did. They totally bungled the investigation, so this trapper, got away literally with murder. And this guy, Dave Clark, and his wife they have serious PTSD, as Stephen mentioned. This time of year, I've heard Dave tell me that he can't go out hiking because every juniper bush, every pinon, every shadow makes him think that something wrong is about to happen. And it's truly, ruined the public lands experience, that place that people go for solace, especially right now in the midst of a pandemic when we need to get outside. And that's totally taken that experience away from these people and so many other people who have had devastating experiences like this. So, like the conibear body crushing trap, the snare is something you can't go back from. A snare is lethal, it's designed to kill. And if you get the wrong thing, that's it.
And think about this for a moment. There's less than 1% of our population traps. It's probably half of 1% in Montana. And yet they're literally controlling our public lands that we go on for a period that begins November 1st. It's completely insane that this small group of people has this overarching power and political power to control our public lands. They're basically setting landmines across the public lands that we all use to recreate on and enjoy. It's completely illogical that they have this level of power.
Yeah, so I want to just show, and I know that this is a difficult conversation for everyone. We won't dwell for the whole hour on this troubling news, but we'll start to talk about some of the successes and some of the ongoing efforts to regulate or eliminate trapping. I just wanted to show you this graphic here so that you can get kind of an overview of what trapping devices are legal in all of the states. And so you can see that most of these are legal in most states. However, a number of states have been successful in banning or regulating the most disturbing practices or the most lethal devices. And then of course there are efforts underway to make other changes in trapping laws, such as restricting where people can set traps. I know all of you are working on that. And then also talking about trap check requirements. And so Stephen and Lisa, maybe you can both talk about some of the campaigns that have been successful, some of the regulations that have come about in the country that are somehow restricting or regulating these traps. Lisa, I know you're working on a number of requests right now in Wyoming.
Well, we've had a few successes, but they're very small. Really, the main success we've had is we've actually legalized removing a dog and livestock from the trap. Believe it or not, that was illegal forever. And we had to go through the legislature and got that tackled, and we had a 13-member unanimous vote for support on that. Right now, we are in the process of, there's a somewhat of a movement here with the commission and with the wildlife managers. It's a start. It's not quite what we want it to be, but we've had internal surveys. Game and Fish has done some internal surveys for the past few months, and they've invited people from the public to go to meetings. The survey, actually, a questionnaire was, there were 55 trappers, and there were 8 members from the public. So we knew immediately what we were up against and what the outcome would probably be. So right now, out of everything we've talked about, which was non-target trapping, snaring, setbacks, trap-free areas, mandatory signage, what we have that's going to be recommended to the commission on Tuesday is mandatory trapping education. Now, that's good. It's on the bottom of our list, but it's good. The trappers agreed with that as the only thing they would agree with. Mm-hmm. And then, so Game and Fish took that we agreed on, they agreed on, and they're going to put that forth to the legislature next, this coming session. So that's actually not a Game and Fish. It's not under their jurisdiction. It's under the legislature jurisdiction. So it has to be a legislative statute. Will that pass? We don't know, but we're working on it. It's a budget year and every single bill has to have a majority vote. So it's hard enough on a regular year. So, but there seems to be some movement on that. There's just a little bit, everything else is recommended, no requirements, there may be some trap-free areas within the actual game, the commission owned lands. You're probably familiar with that. I don't know if you have that, Chris or Stephen, in your states, but I don't use those lands. So, and there's a little bit about an education page, in the trapper education, there's a grandfather clause that you only have to be 21 or younger to have to take it. So it's actually those who are older than that are breaking the laws right now or doing illegal trapping. So it feels almost like a trapper referendum in a way. Many of the game and fish, I think you mentioned it, Stephen, our game and fish staff, many are trappers. They're a trapper or two on the commission, or they're friends with trappers. So we're breaking through. We're breaking through this slowly. We are pulling the governor in on it. The governor appoints the commissioners, and we've got 2 positions coming up soon. So we're going to push for non-consumptive choices, appointments for those 2. And we've got other people working with us to do that. Mm-hmm. But it looks like we might get some setbacks around trails and campgrounds, maybe 500 feet. We're not sure. That's on the agenda. That's good. That's not usually where those accidents happen around here anyway, but we'll take it as a start. Meanwhile, if we get even one of these, we have a lot of people working on it, a lot of letters being written right now. Mm-hmm. I've probably gotten several letters sent to me as we've been talking. If we get that far, meanwhile, traps are legal directly on trails. Anywhere you can walk your dog, traps are legal. So, so every other state is ahead of us. And animals are going to be killed, and pretty soon the phone's going to ring off the hook. There's going to be something serious every week. There are going to be animals killed. There are going to be dogs killed. And we don't have the numbers of non-target animals.
Right. So I want to give Stephen and Chris a chance to weigh in too about some of the successes that have happened in trapping regulation and the current efforts that you're involved in. But I thought I'd mention too that one of the successes is happening kind of organically, which is that interest in trapping itself is declining. I checked in on here in Oregon in 1997, the state would issue over 2,000 fur bearer licenses, trapping licenses a year, and now they're issuing about 1,000. We know in Montana, they still issue about 5,000 trap permits a year. Maybe 1,500 of those are actively trapping. And I know in New Mexico, they have about 1,900 for trapping licenses in any year. And those numbers are declining. So I think naturally there's just generally less interest in this as a hobby or as a form of income for people who are selling the pelts. But another thing that we can do to help is just to increase the awareness. When there are those cases of a dog that dies in a snare, or here in Oregon, we had a case with some residents happening upon a trapping site and getting video of animals in snares and just being absolutely horrified, because I think a lot of us just are not aware that this is happening and how often it's happening. So that's a big part of the reason that we're doing this webinar today, is to increase the awareness and then increase people's interest in joining us in campaigns when there are proposed regulations or law changes that would restrict trapping. But Chris and Stephen, I wanted to get back to you both describing what campaigns have been successful and what campaigns are in the works now.
Well, if I can say to begin with, we just elected a governor who says one of his fondest memories was trapping with his daughter. So that should give you a perspective of where things are headed in Montana. We've done two things, one of which we're working with the Mountain Lion Foundation and with Wild Earth Guardians on, and that is we've got a campaign now working to end trapping in the urban interface, the urban wildland interface. And the idea there is that we have some urban communities in Montana, and those communities, by and large, are dog friendly and dog happy, and people who like to recreate. I can certainly say that for Missoula. I could say that for any of the other communities. And they're also where the bulk of votes are in our state. And so we're working to get areas put off limits to trapping to sort of create areas of protection for wildlife. These include on the rivers, this includes on public lands. This could be Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, or state lands. And we've put a proposal together for Missoula. We're working on one now for Bozeman. More, rolling it back to an even more local level, one of the things we did after that dog was killed here in Missoula was we took a look at the statutes on the city level. And it was really interesting when you kind of open the door there. So we know trapping's illegal in the city, but we didn't understand where the rules were. And so when we began to investigate, we discovered that trapping was put under block management for hunting. And so no one in the city could even find the trapping regulations because they were hidden there. And what we were able to do with the city council, we just passed a resolution that will put a value on all animals. It used to be if you had a pedigree dog, then you had a value. If you had a dog that you adopted, it had no value. Now there'll be a set value for all animals. And there will be harsher penalties for those that illegally trap. And for the first time, we've got the city to agree to put up signs saying no trapping on open space lands and other areas, which is really important because trappers fight against having any signage that lets you know there can't be trapping. And so those are major steps, and we hope to have that one day with our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which is completely in bed with the trappers, as Lisa brought up. They trap themselves. They're at the beck and call of trappers. And so we are fighting not only to educate people about trapping, but to educate people about Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Most people don't understand what really occurs with that agency in terms of not using sound science and other things. And so we're trying to show that to the public so they have a much more informed understanding of what's going on.
Thanks, Stephen.
So I'm going to tell the story of what's happening here in New Mexico, and apologies in advance. I'm going to take us down a couple side roads, but hopefully it won't last too long. First and foremost, I should say that Wild Earth Guardians helps to lead a coalition down here called Trap Free New Mexico. And so I speak kind of for that coalition, but it's not to say that I'm doing all of that work. So that's got to be made clear. So in 2019, Trap Free New Mexico ran legislation here to ban recreational commercial trapping on all public lands in the state. This is the third or fourth time this legislation had been run, and we got the legislation further than it had ever gone in the legislature. There was kind of a showing of support, recognition that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, but ultimately we couldn't get that legislation over the line. So later that year, the Department of Game and Fish, which much like in Montana and Wyoming is very much aligned with the interests of trappers, they started a rulemaking process to try to kind of make some tweaks around the edges to make people feel better about the trapping regulations. And included in that rulemaking was slight increases in setbacks on trails, mandatory trapper education, which seems like it should have been happening all along, frankly, and some closed areas around the state. And I'm showing this interactive map, which you can find at trapfreenm.org, which shows all the trapping incidents that we've been able to identify in the state. And they closed 0.5% of all public lands in New Mexico, which is just a joke, first and foremost, but also the areas they chose to close are notable for two reasons. One is that we haven't found many trapping incidents happening in those areas, so they're not necessarily high conflict, high problem areas. And secondly, they're close to kind of urban, media centers. And I think part of the goal for Game and Fish was to kind of assuage the concerns of people who may not be, hyper aware of the issue and just say, oh, well, this area close to my backyard is closed, so the issue's been solved. But the reality is it's a statewide issue. And above all, it's rural people who, neighbor these public lands who most frequently encounter these traps and most frequently are harmed by the practice of trapping. So that rulemaking went through. We were very vocal saying, fine, great, but this is totally inadequate. And, Game and Fish had started this process to head us off from running legislation. And I think the public saw clearly through that ruse. And the public is totally unsatisfied too. There were no changes to wildlife numbers that can be caught, no bag limits, no real protections for people. So we'll be back again in 2021 with legislation that again would ban trapping on all public lands in New Mexico. There's some common sense exemptions in that legislation. There's an exemption for tribal and Pueblo land and for tribal and Pueblo ceremonial purposes, for immediate human health and public safety concerns, naturally, for bona fide scientific research. And then, if there is an issue of repeated depredation on livestock, Game and Fish still has the authority to come in and use non-lethal traps to try to solve that problem. Although personally, I think the science shows that trapping is not going to solve depredation issues and in fact exacerbates it. So we're gearing up for the 2021 legislative session here in New Mexico. We're optimistic that we can get this done. We're going to need all the help we can, both from inside and outside the state, and happy to talk about that later. But our goal is to get these dangerous, cruel, indiscriminate devices off of public lands entirely.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. And the Mountain Lion Foundation has been a member of that coalition as well. And so if you're on our email list, you can get on our email list just by going to mountainlion.org and signing up as a member. Just sign up for our newsletter. And then if we know you're in New Mexico, when that comes up, we will get emails to you and make sure that you have an opportunity to weigh in. And likewise with any of these states, any of these causes, when there's a chance to weigh in, we really need to see the public. What we see a lot of times is that at these meetings, there isn't a lot of public input because often people aren't even aware of what's on the agenda. And there seems to be, maybe a growing awareness, hopefully through campaigns and through webinars like this, but probably not a lot of general awareness in the public about, well, like even the fact that we may be hiking with our dogs near traps on public land. And maybe the three of you could weigh in too on what your sense is of the public's awareness and what might help for getting people to be more aware and more involved in this issue. And thank you, Chris. I see that you just posted your link to the Wild Earth Guardians. You can also get on Wyoming Untrapped and Footloose Montana and sign up for their email lists and see their information. But what do you think would help as far as public involvement? Are you seeing that's growing?
Well, I'm going to give you one example that I think really made a difference. And so people understand, I moved up to Montana from New Mexico 2 years ago. And I was involved down there in getting the Wolf Coalition started and other issues. But what I saw down there was, yeah, people didn't really realize that trapping is occurring. And I can tell you that I can go to anybody, I live in an apartment complex here, and 9 out of 10 people they're shocked when they hear trapping is still occurring. They can't believe it. But aside from that was, how did we really make a difference? Well, we made a difference when we went from having like 10 trappers and 3 citizens at a Fish, Wildlife, and Parks meeting to suddenly having a couple hundred people in that room shouting down the commission and saying, shame if you continue to allow wolves to be killed and other species like that. That began to get the media involved. that media exposure began to give a lot more play into what was happening. And so I think that, it's really about education. There's so much education, but also making citizens feel involved and engaged and getting them to have their voice heard. We need them at these Fish, Wildlife, and Parks meetings. We need them to be writing letters to the editor. We need them to be engaged and letting the politicians understand this is not acceptable anymore. And that all is part of educating yourself and understanding what's going on, talking to your neighbor. There's so many people here in Missoula, in Montana, where trapping has this oversized influence that have no idea it occurs. And that's why we have these tragic situations that Lisa's talked about, Chris has talked about, where people are out with their dog and the next thing they know, a disaster occurs. And it's because these traps are literally able to be in many, many places they should never be allowed to be.
I think that's a really good point that Stephen made, that most people still don't know that this happens. And I think talking about New Mexico specifically, I think we really made inroads here in terms of raising the general public awareness that this does occur. The sad fact is that awareness kind of ebbs and flows depending on a horrific story of a dog being caught or a dog dying, and those stories are illuminating and they're important, and they are they help drive the agenda for sure, but they really represent a tiny fraction of the devastation and the cruelty that's going on in
Sure.
New Mexico. Since 2008, we've had about 150,000 animals killed in traps for private profit, for fun, for a hobby reenactment activity, essentially. And every one of those animals has a story like Roxy, or like the stories that Lisa and Stephen are telling. And just because we don't always hear those stories doesn't mean that that kind of devastation isn't happening every single day out in the wild, out on public lands. And so I think in New Mexico, we've raised awareness that this is happening through some of these stories, but it's up to us to keep, making clear that those stories are the tip of the iceberg, and they don't paint the whole picture. And in fact, the whole picture is much more horrific than those stories would make people believe.
Yes, and Stephen, I know you work with a veterinarian in your state who pointed out he was able to talk to you about some of the injuries he's seen, animals that have been brought in after they were caught in traps. Of course, these would be mostly pets. But what he pointed out is, we wouldn't kill cows or any other animal in this way. It would be just unthinkable, and there'd be terrible public outrage. But we kill wildlife this way every day, and I think it's problematic that it happens outside of most of our awareness, and so it makes it difficult to know to do anything about it.
Well, we're dealing in a situation where people still have this idea that man is so superior, and we're not understanding the value of coexistence, the miracle of having these animals in the wild. What some people in our state are finally beginning to say is, it's my wildlife too. In other words, it's not enough that these guys get to trap for their recreation. How about the fact that we're the majority and we want to see wolves in the wild? We want to see a pine marten when we go for a hike. We'd love to see otters in the river. It's our wildlife. And we have less than 1% of a population deciding that no, they can go out and kill for fun, for their perverted sense of it's a Christmas present when I discover a trap and look what I found. This isn't the way it should be. And we as a people, as we watch the great extinction occurring around the world, why on earth are we not setting an example in the United States by saying and joining so many other countries that have already said no more to trapping?
Thank you for that. Yes, and in the 5 minutes or so before I open it up to question, I thought we might talk a little bit about some of the conservation issues, right? Because it's common in Western states for the animals that are considered unprotected animals, like coyotes and badgers and nutria and possums, that there are just absolutely no bag limits on them at all. And that there are seasons and bag limits on other animals, but that because these traps are so indiscriminate, they're going to catch any animal. We know that bald eagles or condors or wolverines, lynx, endangered animals can be caught in these traps. And we saw a video this week from Idaho where Fish and Game agents actually did a beautiful job of releasing a mountain lion who was accidentally caught in a leg hold trap. And they let him loose and said that they let him loose uninjured. But you watch that video and think, well, his paw was trapped in there and he was thrashing around and he climbed up into a tree while he was attached to the trap. It's hard to imagine that he's not injured. And there he is out there in the wild. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the cruelty issues, which certainly are significant. But I thought we could wrap up the last few minutes by talking about the conservation issues and the role that some of these animals play and the risk that we're taking by letting these devices be present on our wild lands almost everywhere. Anyone would like to weigh in on that?
Go ahead, Lisa. You haven't said anything in a while.
Well, that's probably a good thing. You know, when you're working through this over the years and you're up against one of the most challenging walls ever, as these guys know, you wonder what's the next best thing to do? How can we reach more people, and how can we convince people that we should coexist with wildlife? And it's these little incidents in your neighborhood. If there's a mountain lion in my neighborhood, I reach out to everyone that lives here. Keep your children close. Watch out. She's just traveling through. She killed a mule deer on the top of the hill. She'll be gone in 2 days, and sure enough, she is. She's just moving through, a mountain lion. And we try to do those kind of things where we do a lot of social media to reach people. We have messages, we have marketers, we have graphic designers. Our ads work, we believe. Of course, nothing works better, as you know, than an animal being killed. And the owner actually, being the advocate for stopping trapping, really, it's very powerful. And that's happening a lot. So we've got Fremont County just started a little organization. We've got a group in Laramie that have started some work too. But I think what we're trying to do is teach the value of all wildlife. So fur bearers and predatory animals mean nothing to our game managers. That's not their job. So when they're killed, they're run over with snowmobiles. And we tried to start legislation last year for that, or 2 years ago, and we didn't get very far, but the message got out there. The message, every legislator now knows about that. So our next campaign is billboards. Footloose has already done that. Wild Earth Guardians have some fabulous billboards. And we have some funding now to do that. We're going to start in December, and they're very powerful messages. And since Yellowstone and Grand Teton Park are in our neighborhood, we're going to set up a rotary billboard ad where 40,000 people a day are going to see these ads that go into Yellowstone. And I think that's going to be very effective. And I think if all of our organizations could pull together and try to do that, and even if you all could even join us around the Yellowstone and have more than one sign, like one and then two and then another, I think that would be very effective. As far as conservation, will we change the minds of and I'll end this quickly, Game and Fish and the agencies? We could, but it may be based on the economy. Tourism is our number 2 economy in Wyoming for the first time ever. That's huge. That's going to shift. That's going to cause a shift in the management of wildlife. So we hope that and the economies might be what it takes. I think our Game and Fish now is having budget issues because of COVID. And I
Mhm.
think they're probably looking at the non-consumptive users as more of a way to earn some income. So we'll hope. We're there and ready
Mhm.
to work.
Yeah, there are more of us. There always are. You know, when you've got 1,000 or maybe 5,000 trappers in any given state, you think of all the vast majority of people who are not engaging in that activity and need to have their voices heard. So it's straight up at the top of the hour now, and I know some people who are watching may need to
Oops.
leave pretty soon, but I want to make sure that people who want to ask a question have a chance to do that.
Michelle,
so-
can I
Yes.
say one thing before you do that? I just
Mhm.
want to just put this out for people to think about. And I say this as a state, and I feel like it's a state like Lisa. We need federal checks on the behavior of our states. And one of the things we have an opportunity here is we have a new administration coming in, and we saw the power of executive orders from Donald Trump. How about Joe Biden using an executive order to ban trapping on public lands in the United States or in the Western United States? He's a man who seems to care about animals. And I think that we have to have something very proactive that all of us can get behind and ask the new president to use his powers to do this. I know it sounds far-fetched. I don't think it's as far-fetched if all of us are working on that together.
Thank you, Stephen. So if you do want to ask a question, you will just use the raised hand feature. And after you've raised your hand, then Chelsea will call your name and unmute you so that you can ask a question. You may need to unmute yourself on your end as well. And then we're asking that you keep your question as brief as possible, 30 seconds to a minute, so that people do have a chance to ask questions if they want to. And so while we're waiting for the first question, Chris, I wanted to give you a chance also to say a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You know, I think trapping is certainly a public safety issue. It's an economic issue, which Lisa mentioned. It's an animal welfare issue, but frankly, to me, it is primarily a conservation issue. Don't get me wrong; it's all of the above. But in my heart, first and foremost, I'm a conservationist, and the amount of kind of carnage that we are inflicting on wildlife species is, first of all, it's unknown and it's kind of unimaginable. And as I stated at the outset, this is happening during a mass extinction event. It's happening while these animals, especially here in the arid Southwest, are being pushed to the brink by drought, by climate change, by urban expansion. You know, we had hundreds and thousands of birds drop out of the sky in New Mexico in September. And these kind of events are going to become the new norm. And if we continue to trap, you know, as kind of an unfettered exploitation of nature, we're going to continue to see things get worse and worse. And yeah, most people know about the important role that apex carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears and lions play. And don't get me wrong, those are crucial, but every animal plays a crucial ecosystem role. Mesocarnivores like coyotes, like foxes, they're helping to prompt biodiversity, to prompt plant life. They're helping to tamp down diseases like Lyme disease. It turns out we have a zoonotic disease problem in this country, and you know, messing with habitat and wildlife populations may well be part of that problem. So this is totally interconnected to all conservation matters, to water matters. I mean, we're seeing the effects of beavers when they're allowed to be reintroduced rather than trapped to be made into pelts. So not to keep going and going, but this is a conservation issue along with all those other issues to me. And I can't stress that enough.
Thank you. So I know we have a number of people waiting to ask questions. It looks to me like Chris in Houston is the first one waiting to ask a question. And I appreciate what you're all saying about the conservation issues. And there is a proposal right now in Oregon that would ban beaver trapping on federal lands because of the important role that beavers play in our ecology.
Okay, our first question is from Chris in Houston.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. It seems like trapping is such an archaic thing these days. And I think the majority of public would be, I mean, I'm aware of it because I'm just enamored with wildlife. But I think if you ask most people, they would consider this very horrific. With the change in the administration and most state U.S. Fish and Wildlife departments being controlled by Department of the Interior, do you think the new person in the Department of Interior will make some changes? I know Stephen Capra mentioned about an executive order, but it just seems like, you know, everybody loves the public lands. They love the national parks. You go there to look at wildlife. This seems like it should be a slam dunk. That's it.
Well, the one thing I want to just caution you about in this is trappers have been very effective of calling this a slippery slope with hunters. So they've used a lot of their influence to say, well, if you get rid of trapping, hunting's next. And that's where sometimes there's pushback within administrations and concern because they don't want to get hunters completely upset. We've seen that a number of times, and that's used very effectively up here in Montana on a regular basis.
I understand that, but what about, you know, in terms of when you're in hunting, there's always a limit to how much deer you could take, or and especially if you're a fisherman, how much fish, the size. Why can't we get just general wildlife at least in that realm of you can't take an unlimited amount?
One other thing to say on that is just that when you think about your federal public lands, you have the Forest Service managing Forest Service land, you have the Park Service managing their land. Wildlife is managed by your Fish and Wildlife Agency. I mean, they shouldn't be managed to begin with, but they are managed. And so that brings that issue to a more local level. And I mean, I think it's absurd. And I do think if we have a new Interior Secretary, you're going to see better things. But that's going to be mostly about the land. And that's where I think we have to have some actions that can be done. We're certainly going to see better things done for the habitat. And we're definitely going to see better things done. But we have to really push this issue to educate the public and get them engaged.
I just want to thank all the panels of this webinar. I think you guys are fantastic and you're doing a great job.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Chris.
Thanks.
All right, our next question is from Haymon. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my first name is Rachel, and I'm living here in California and wondering how many permits get issued in California annually now, whether the scope of the problem here is as great as it is in the states represented by the panelists. I'd also like to thank all the panelists for what they're doing, and we sure want to try to help you to achieve your goals. So I hope that the Mountain Lion Foundation will assist us in doing that. Thank you.
Chris, do you happen to know? I don't know off the top of my head how many permits are issued in California.
I don't. I'm sorry. I could.
Didn't California just eliminate trapping across the board? My understanding was they passed it. The governor made that the law. I don't think you have trapping even on private property anymore.
I think they've tightened up recreational trapping, but we do know that the USDA Wildlife Services is still doing a fair amount of trapping in parts of the state. But Rachel, I know I have your email address. I will look that up and send it to you.
Yeah, and I just put my email address in the chat if Rachel or anyone else would like to answer a question, I'm happy to also look that up. Sorry
Yeah.
for not knowing offhand.
Okay, we just had an answer here, but from one person, so,
Oh, good.
yeah.
Chelsea, can we go to the next question?
Next question is from Bill Woodbridge.
Hi, Bill.
Bill, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, I'm in Santa Barbara. I'm just enraged and really shocked that so much of this is so prevalent. I thought Fish and Game and Parks people were supposed to protect animals, but obviously that's not going on. The head of the California Fish and Game, the previous head, was proudly displayed with a dead mountain lion and a rifle in his hand. That's who was heading up our agency. So I think this idea of a federal mandate to eliminate trapping would be a great idea, because I just feel helpless not living in your states and not knowing what to do. But I think the idea of a federal mandate by executive order would be great. But how do we go about starting that movement? Because somebody's got to get these local, trappers that are on the parks and wildlife boards, out of there.
Well, I think what you have to do is you have to just say, this is one of those tough love situations where, you're not going to get our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency to do the right thing. It's not there. It's corrupt from inside with the trapping thing. That's why I was saying for states like Lisa and mine, I believe that Chris is in a state that's going to ban trapping in a few years. But I think that we're in a much different situation. And it's much like saying to our state, hey, we want to create a national park. What does everybody in the state think? And they say, no, hell no, we don't want a national park. Sometimes the federal government has to step in. And I think that there's a real ability for this, but I think it's going to require first all of our groups coming together to be on board with something like this, and then getting everybody to understand it and showing a clear path. And I do think that sending a letter to the Biden administration is never a bad idea to make clear this is a concept. They've got to start to hear it. They've got to start hearing from people that this is an idea. And he's already said on day one, he's going to be doing a lot of executive orders. I wouldn't anticipate this as being one of them. But this is part of how we do it. And that it's about going back to Washington and making your voice heard, as all of us have done. And it's really about being engaged and talking about this to friends of yours. It makes a huge difference.
But who specifically at the administration would we write to? You write a letter to the president, it's not going to be read by anybody but a 10th level staffer and thrown in the wastebasket. So do you write to Department of Interior, or who do you write to?
Well, I think we have to see his cabinet unfold. And I think that'll be one aspect of it. And I think that once we see a better idea of the cabinet, and I can tell you, I worked for a number of years creating national monuments in New Mexico. And what really came out of that was that there was a gatekeeper of sorts. And I don't know that gatekeeper at this point, but that gatekeeper will appear. I'm trying to think who it was during the monument struggle. Chris, you may remember. He was a Clinton person who carried over, and he was the point person that would go to the President Obama at the time and say, these are the areas that need to be protected, and it would be worked out. Do you remember him, Chris? I'm drawing a blank right now.
I don't. I do have something to chime in with, but I don't know who that is. Bill, I would say you've kind of identified one of the real problems that we all work against, which is the history and fundamental problem with state wildlife agencies. And don't get me wrong, some states are better than others, but there's a really interesting history there and why they are the way they are. I just posted a little YouTube video in the chat, which just touches on that. But the brief version is that these state wildlife agencies rose from and are still largely funded by and directed by hunting interests. And in order for that fundamental problem to change, we need to totally rethink the way state wildlife agencies work, which includes funding changes, et cetera, et cetera. So just pointing that out. But it's a good point that you made.
Yeah, much work to be done. Just want to check in on our time. We have 15 minutes left, and we do still have several people waiting to ask questions.
Is Lisa still with us?
Yes, Lisa's still here.
Yeah, hey.
Hey.
Yeah.
There you are.
All right, our next question is from Rebecca.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm in California and I run a humane wildlife control business as well as rescue organization. And I've been involved with the trapping issue here for quite some time. And so the fur trapping, commercial and recreational fur trapping was banned. And interestingly, I just found this out by kind of accident, is when that happened, the permitting process for pest control, if you will, nuisance wildlife trappers, the permitting process changed. And now, really cool, they have to turn in an annual report of how many traps they set, how many animals, what species they caught, in what county. So we're really going to get a good picture of what's going on here, at least in this state. And God, the stories you were telling, I can't believe how barbaric it still is in other states. And I'm not thrilled with everything California is doing with the trapping. It needs to get better, but it's going in the right direction, to the point where USDA has to follow our regulations for 65.5. So they don't like that, but they got that told to them a couple of years ago because of something that I pushed to the front and didn't let go of. But my question, sorry about that. My question was, since the wildlife is held in trust, is there any, for the benefit of all, is there any way to use that to, bring a lawsuit or something onto the state?
That's been discussed a number of times, and I've discussed that with attorneys up here, and they've told me it will not work.
Okay.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the
Thank
work
you all.
that you're
Thank you all
doing.
so much.
And yes, in a lot of wildlife issues, we really wish that we could replicate what's happening in California to the other states. Chelsea, could we have the next question?
Yes, next question is from Janice.
Hi, thank you. Janice from Clear Out in Midwest Ohio.
Hi.
Hi. My question is, does anybody know how the US's regulations on this trapping, which of course I'm echoing everybody else, I find it very barbaric, compares to what, like the rest of the world, for instance, like what Europe is doing or has done? Can anybody speak about that?
Lisa, do you have input there?
I don't.
Stephen may have more details, but we're lagging way behind. My understanding is over 100 countries have banned the use of leg hold traps entirely.
Yes.
I believe the EU has banned almost all trapping. I can't speak to every situation, but we're lagging way, way behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Chris Tromborg, please ask your question.
Hi there, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
That is an interesting point to have just made, because many European countries have indeed outlawed the use of leg hold traps, but they import animal products. And all you have to do is look at the CITES Convention. And, places like France, which talk a good game, still are #1 producers of some luxurious fur products. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's an issue. California has lots of warts and sins to atone for, but we did outlaw bobcat trapping a few years ago. The Mountain Lion Foundation worked a lot on that, so we're kind of proud of it. My question is a very simple one. I teach animal behavior and came in very late. Has this is this being recorded? And if it has been recorded, do we have your permission to distribute it to other possible venues?
It will be recorded, Dr. Tromborg, and we will get it to you. And because you're one of our honored board members, I'm sure you are free to do whatever you like with that recording.
I'm going to wave it around like a tentacle. I mean, this
Yeah.
is the issue that got me into animal behavior, was fur trapping back in 1969. So you're talking to a geezer here.
That's great.
All right, thank you.
That's good to know. This was your introductory issue. Chelsea, could we have the next question, please?
Yes,
Thank you, Dr.
next-
Tromborg.
Yep. Next question, Jerry.
Jerry, you might need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, you know, through this whole discussion, I haven't heard one word about educating children. And that's kind of disappointing to me. So that said, I'll follow up with a few more comments I have. Trappers, you know, trappers have a psychological makeup, whereas they feel that predators are not worthy of living. Do you think you can change that? I mean, is that your goal, to change that mindset that's embedded in them? I don't think we can, but we can educate our children to be better humans, teach them to respect living things. So I'd like to know, what are your groups doing to educate children? Now, trappers have classes where they bring the children in and teach them how to trap. So are any of your groups, are you doing anything for kids?
I'd like to, Jerry, hi, nice to see you. Nice to hear your voice. We're going to begin a Zoom presentation to students, and we've got a person lined up to do the presentation. It's going to be a few weeks or months, but it's coming, and it's something that we've been working on. So we will begin this process in the very near future, because I agree with you completely. It's something that needs to be done day one. And you'll notice when you look at trappers in our state, for example, youth trappers don't have to pay for anything to go trap. So there's a lot of incentive for young people, but we're not giving them enough incentive on the other end. And so it's definitely in the toolbox.
Yeah, I can say too that at the Mountain Lion Foundation, this is definitely a focus of ours, the Teach Your Children Well, knowing that that is the future. And that is where you're going to get a lot of change. And we're about to introduce a new section on our website called the Kids Corner. And we are also hosting, you'll find the information on our website, we're hosting a kid-friendly conservation film festival. So agree with you that educating children really is important. Thank you for that question. We still have a couple more questions left. Chelsea, could we?
Yes, we have 2 more questions left.
All
Next
right.
is Art.
I'm calling from Arizona. Can you tell me, what are the consequences for those that are caught trapping illegally?
It would depend on the state.
Not as high as we would like for it to be. But you know, our laws aren't very strict right now. And even when all the trappers that we have seen that have been cited and taken to court are never given the maximum penalty, which is already low. You know, so I don't know if that'll change. I don't know, how's it going in Montana and New Mexico?
It's a misdemeanor up here. And in fact, when I was working on changing the regulations in the city limits, the one thing I was told repeatedly is we're not putting anybody in jail under any circumstances.
Yeah, I suspect that it varies quite a bit state to state. Here in New Mexico, you can't be, I mean, what you are charged with is violating trapping regulations, not necessarily capturing a non-target animal. And just like in Wyoming and Montana, the punishments are pretty meek, and the loopholes are pretty large.
We've had some jail terms here. It's been good. We had a 5-day and a 10-day.
Was it egregious?
Well, it was Well, the trap line that was set in Cache Creek,
Oh, okay.
it was, yeah, a young man who was causing the problems, and let's see, I think the citation was for non-target animals in the wrong areas, and he was from out of state, so the judge was actually pretty kind to him because COVID was just beginning and he didn't have any money, and yeah, but
We have
and
another
there's one-
question and a
sorry.
few more minutes. A few minutes to go.
We have
well, the
5
one
minutes.
about, I'm sorry, go ahead, you ask a question, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, we were talking about PTSD earlier.
Mhm.
Well, there was a trapping incident south of Jackson, and a dog was hurt pretty badly. And there was a big vet bill, and the judge did order the trapper to pay for the bill, and also for some of the medical bills for the PTSD for the woman. So it was,
That's great.
it's up to the judge on that. And he went to jail for 5 days.
Good. Very few minutes left. We have one more question.
Yep, one more question. Last question. Sorry, I don't know the actual name. It just shows as Avilpro 273.
Yeah, my question is about nuisance wildlife. I know that in some states it's illegal for trappers to relocate the animals that they trap. Like, I'm just wondering why that is. Why can't they just relocate the animals that they trap or they trap? I mean, I know that in southern.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'll ask you to go ahead and answer that question because we've got just about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I think there's ecosystem concerns, invasive species concerns, and human health concerns typically. You know, it's ironic that we have to have trained professionals with government agencies typically, or with at least a license to move wildlife around, but we let trappers, handle dead wildlife, move them around as long as they're dead, which inherently brings up some of the very problems that those laws are meant to, prevent. So those are the answers. It's human health and ecosystem problems with invasive species.
Well, thank you all for the wonderful questions, thoughtful questions. Thank you to our panelists today. And I think they have all shared some links on the chat. You can also find them on the web. Again, it's Lisa Robertson with Wyoming Untrapped, and Stephen Capper with Footloose Montana, and Chris Smith with Wild Earth Guardians. And you, of course, can sign up for our email list also on mountainlion.org. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time and on all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon, everybody.